Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the series Mounts and Memory, a series where we discuss about death, burial, and the afterlife in the Viking Age and a bit beyond. Today, as usual, I am joined by my brilliant colleague Howard Williams, who is going to talk to us today about horse burials, a fascinating topic, so I really hope you enjoy. Howard, over to you.
Hello, yeah. So we've been discussing various aspects, particularly in Iceland, and I think we want to continue this discussion focused on Iceland and this this North Atlantic Western Viking phenomenon, because horse sacrifice is a broader phenomenon we find as an element of mortuary practice, going deeper in time since the Bronze Age, really, and the first adoption of horses in continental Europe, but in and through the Long Iron Age of Scandinavia, but what has really fascinated me is in preparing for this is looking at some of the saga references we talked about before, where horses feature in the remembering the Viking Age, and horses being dispatched at funerals, but also
a lot of mythological horses as well.
And yes, and horses feature so much that I thought, why not just delve into the research that's being done by others and attempt to synopsize it with all the qualifiers as necessary. That I am not the author of this research, but reflecting on its significance in the Viking Age. So I'm sharing some sort of slides to sort of provide a bit of context, and then we'll get into some of the recent arguments about Icelandic horse sacrifice and burial, because there seems to be the point is there seems to be a particular connection with Icelandic settlements and the pagan and early Christian, always put the scare quotes with these categories, but this period of the settlement, and then soon after through the late 9th, 10th and into the 11th century of horses become very important, perhaps even as important, if not more important, in the settlement context, in the colonial context, another term to put scare quotes, than in Norway. So I'm relying on a paper by Maeve Sikora, an Irish archaeologist now at the National Museum in Ireland, and Leifson's doctoral thesis from 2018, which is dedicated to a zoo archaeological analysis. So looking at the actual horse bones, where they survive, and pulling that evidence together. And I thought that would be that's the academic basis of what I'm going to discuss. But it's important to, before that, to remind everyone that we have, and I love this book cover. It's just my favorite archaeology book cover. The book itself is very interesting and is a bit dated, but not too dated. Has some really good papers about burial archaeology in the late 90s from Danish, German and British perspectives. But I love that the front cover is obviously a humorous, if that's possible, given the grim description by Ahmad ibn Fadlan of the Rus funeral of their chief, involving the cremation of a ship on the banks of the Volga, where you've got men clashing their shields, you've got horses being sacrificed, there's the angel of death and the slave girl. It's obviously not exactly as described, and it's not
a very brutal description, particularly what they do to the horses, the dogs and the poultry. That's very brutal. It's way more brutal than the film The 13th Warrior presented it, which I find
absolutely. And you see poor Ahmad ibn Fadlan's there just stroking his beard while this guy nonchalantly goes, well, this is what we do. And he's going,
what are these people doing here?
yeah. And there's the chief mourner being naked with lighting the pyre. So it's obviously collapsing a lot of elements together. And I love the little kid with the play horse just poking his nose and looking on, going, what's going on? And I just love it as a piece of sort of light-hearted art. But it does remind us that the serious point of sharing it is to remind us that, the horse sacrifice, running the horses, then killing the horses, the blood, the violence that would have been a part of alcohol excess, sexual excess, burning the ship, all of this drama and theatre that so many authors have talked about. Now, we're not saying that this is in any way a template for understanding Viking death ritual or the Viking way, but it does give us an insight into how horses will and their killing was a part of the funeral, but how the horses were made to perform as part of the funeral. They may have had roles such as pulling a sled or a cart with the dead upon it. So they may have been active participants in bringing the dead to the site of the funeral, for example. Not here, but maybe in other cases. They may have been ridden by at least certain people to the ceremony. People would have brought horses. They may have traded horses. They may have had horse fights, as they did. We know from, I think, from some of the saga literature they were having at the assemblies. So, you know, I'm not saying we have definitive evidence for that, but also we've got to think of the horses as being deliberately, you know, ridden as part of performance and games. We may be dealing with the sacrifice of the animal as only one element of the many uses of horses and other animals in the Viking world more broadly. And we've got to expect variety and diversity of practice, but this just brings it home. And of course, through the artist's reconstructions, working with Neil Price, we've seen from places as far flung as Kaupang in Norway, these artist reconstructions bring home how at least the higher status ship inhumations and cremations too would have featured the deaths of people, perhaps sometimes the killing of people, but the killing of dogs, horses, and here from Gausel in Norway, we have this is the same ship, two completely different artist reconstructions of the same funeral, which is revealing in itself of how subtle variations change between artistic renditions. But the point I wanted to make here is how the horse's head, this isn't about the whole horse, but the horse's head with its bridle on. So the killing of the horse, the dismemberment of the horse is still does not prevent them presenting the horse as ready for riding, you know. So as with some weapons and other items are broken, this wealthy weapon burial with blacksmith gear, with multiple shields, with textiles in a longship, you know, part of the equipment is breaking objects, and the horse is present with the head. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I'm just giving you that backstory to the Iceland evidence. In Scandinavia, in the Viking world, more broadly, we have evidence of horse sacrifice. And of course, the famous and much discussed dual horses sacrificed with BJ 581 in Birka from the 10th century, where this woman is buried with weapons, gaming pieces, and among the other items, a pair of horses. So, you know, this is a feature of chamber graves, ship burials, and their cremation equivalents, because we have to remember that these large architectural spaces must be surely mirrored with oversized pyres as well, that they're not just creating pyres for the minimum purposes. If you're going to sacrifice a horse or two horses and a bit of a cow or a sheep, you're going to have to create a monumental pyre, and you're going to have a platform or slope to get those animals up onto there. Otherwise, you've got to kill them and then somehow physically haul them up onto this pyre. So the pyre is not simply a space big enough for one body. It's got to be a monumental structure that you're building with an excess of wood, not simply enough to burn a body, but enough to burn multiple animals, and enough wood to provide a stage or a ramp to get those animals up onto a pyre. Now, that's utterly hypothetical. We don't have evidence for that, but I think it's a very, it's an informed, if there was a cremation equivalent to these kind of 10th century chamber graves, they would have needed substantial amounts of wood, resources and labor to bring that pyre together, not this usual fantasy stereotype of one or two guys or gals, just who will burn him or whatever, and then suddenly you're in the middle of a freezing forest, you've managed to light a fire and you walk away while the smoke hangs heavy, or it's a much bigger, it's days of work at least, unless
it would have been a very complex lived experience. I mean, hard for us to grasp because we only see the result, but the performance in itself can make educated guesses, like you said.
But this kind of horse sacrifice seems to be part of these elaborate funerary rituals. And here also from Neil Price's thesis, now reprinted, we have another two images, which I think captivated me when I first saw this, when it came out in the early noughties, and made me think again about the whole argument about chair burials, chair seated burials. I'm not confident to pass judgment on the debates about that, but it's certainly the performance of a spear being thrown over the assemblage and two horses somehow got how they get them down into that space, and then how do they posture them, because these animals seem to be very carefully placed and arranged. And so for me, this is not a single right, but it's a persistent element of aristocratic, or at least higher status funerals in the Viking Age. Now, this is one that may not be as it appears. Arild Klokkevold's thesis, which I've recently examined, actually includes a new zooarchaeological study by Sean Denham, which tells us that this is likely not the case a horse, but if anything, a cow, possibly a cow's head.
That is very disappointing.
Yes, yeah, but this is the Galzel Queen, as she's called, one of these seeresses or volvas, and she's got multiple horns. She's got the tortoise brooches. She's got, this is all about prestige and power, and this animal has been sacrificed. Maybe not a horse in this case, but so the animal may change, and details of how these animals were present, either whole animals or part animals, but we're seeing this repeated practice. And of course, this has fed into pop culture. So I cannot resist showing you reminders of season 1, episode 4 of the TV show Vikings. We're on the Northumbrian coast. The warriors that are killed with their first fight against the Saxons are sacrificed, and they kill one of the horses of the Saxons to provide a sacrifice. And this shows how that TV show is directly inspired by the art being used to convey archaeological interpretation. So that first season is heavily inspired by Neil Price's work and other scholars thinking about the theatre.
What I don't really understand these pictures are the shields. Don't the shields have a bit of a weird position in this grave?
Yeah, and it's just basically a sandcastle grave. They're actually just digging it in the sand. So the idea, I suppose, is that they're makeshift burials, but they're trying to give them and I suppose the Salma ship burials, again, are coming into their thinking of a shoreline location for the battle dead. I suppose that's my defense of it. I'm not, there's no equivalent in the archaeological record for this. And
I was thinking about the Salma burials as well, because I as far as I know, they like organize these shields very neatly in the grave.
No. So this looks like, it doesn't quite make sense, does it? I agree with you. And through the TV show, I don't think you can see it quite clearly in this screen cap, but at the bottom of it, she's got a horse's head. So this is an attempt to give Aslog, Oslog, I don't know how you say her name actually, Oslog. Anyway, the queen who gets killed by Lagertha in the TV show. Sorry for the spoilers. She is given this ridiculous, I say ridiculous, but she's given a Galzel Queen on water. So the horse is sacrificed, they process her body, you get this version of the TV show. We cannot deny that this is directly inspired by archaeological writings, and if we don't like it, then we have to blame ourselves, because although the fact they sort of that raft they put her on must be motorized, because it goes out so quickly, and then they fire flaming arrows for reasons that no one knows or cares, because they
probably also a little bit of Volsunga saga involved here.
Yeah. So there's yes. So it's not archaeological, but it is archaeologically inspired, heavily archaeologically inspired. So this funeral is really obviously, again, completely unevidenced, but on ice, a funeral on ice, and I won't go for the elaborate elements, but what's really interesting is they didn't have to do this, in the modern sensitivities about animal rights, but they felt that the show felt for authenticity, despite this funeral being utterly fabulous and almost ridiculous in being overblown and unhinged. It's supposed to be a legendary funeral with but they still have animal sacrifice, particularly horse sacrifice, as an integral element. So I just think that's worth mentioning before we talk about horse burial in Iceland. So we have to see that both in the genuine archaeological evidence and our written sources, and in our pop culture, horse sacrifice features heavily.
For good reason. I mean, horses, in a way, they are weird animals, right? I mean, they're sort of liminal because they function very well both in you could imagine people thinking of them as these powerful creatures and maybe also absorbing their power as well, because eating horse meat was also a thing in the
Yeah.
Viking Age and before that. So I think that's also something to remember. I mean, the power of these animals from their very liminal state, that they could function well in all kinds of worlds, and this is also reflected in some very interesting stories from mythology, right, where you use the horse in order to travel to the other world, to hell.
In terms of thinking about the ways in which horses may have been used, transport, traction, races, games, we can imagine that part of the the sacrifices, this ritualized consumption of horse meat, that may have been not something you had every day. Not everyone was going around chowing down on their favorite pony, but it is a part of. We don't know how common that is, but it is mentioned. I defer to you on this, but it is mentioned in sources from as a feature.
Yeah, there is this famous episode in the saga of Håkon the Good,
That's the one.
when he has a lot of troubles with the local farmers, who complained to him that he promised them liberties and that he was going to be a good king, and he was chosen as a king, but then they were afraid of giving up the ancestors' customs, and one of these customs was actually eating the horse's meat. And eventually they do reach a compromise, and the compromise is that the king is allowed to refrain from eating this meat, but he should inhale the smoke given by the pot. But then in the end, nobody was satisfied with this approach. But yeah, it is probably the best, most reflective example we have about these tensions that existed between different groups of people and different religious dimensions of the time. Yeah.
So horses would be wealthy. They would exhibit wealth. They would embody wealth because they're expensive to maintain and to
Absolutely,
keep.
yeah.
They are therefore linked to social status. Connections with fertility are evoked and the god Frey, but they may not be exclusively that. They may be, all the gods had horses, all the gods. So you could potentially have, connections for individual families and groups with different gods. I mean, I don't see why it has to be exclusively one, but horses can be adaptable and they can be psychopomps that take you to the next world. They are a beast that you can ride on beyond this world. So while I don't want to see every horse sacrificed as this animal will ride him to Valhalla, or they may have different destinations, different localized beliefs, as we've talked about before. But we should see it as a journeying. It's about mobility, and mobility exudes status. You've got the wealth and power to ride on a horse. You've got to and that may be taken into the next world. And
yeah, it's mentioned quite specifically that Odin cannot travel to the other world, to hell, to the realm of hell, without his horse Sleipnir. So yeah, definitely a connection to the afterworld. The connection with fertility, yeah, it's a bit problematic here because we have the saga of Hrafnkel, you mentioned before, with the horse dedicated to Freyr. That's actually the only example with this connection. And there's also a later story called the Volstathotter, the one, I don't know if you know it, but it is the one describing the phallus of a horse being used in a farm.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And there has been a great debate about that as well, because there is a group of scholars who, for example, Clive Tolley, who say that this was actually an invention of the author writing in the 14th century, because he compared the linguistic markers of the story with another story, which is the saga of Gautrek. The saga of Gautrek, where again we have this interesting myth of old people going to die by throwing themselves off a cliff. Just again turned into this pop culture element, but it's only mentioned in this story. So yeah, coming back to the Volstathotter, so the idea is that it was deliberately constructed as something very archaic, in the sense that, okay, there are these uncivilized groups of people living in northern Norway engaging in this sort of behavior, and there come the Christians to make sure that they don't do that ever again. So the story is also, kind of funny in a way. It has this very sarcastic tone. But you do have a connection with fertility there, because it's almost like this phallus is embalmed, and then they engage in this weird ritual in the household where the lady of the house is the one who basically causes this phallus to come back to life in a way, in order to bring fertility and prosperity. So yeah, it might have been an invention, but at the same time, I do think it evokes some kind of connection. For example, the element, when we have the description about the horse's phallus being embalmed in these herbs, then this recalls a little bit some ancient Futharic inscriptions bearing the name Leok, which is leek. So leek used also in this sort of like cult of fertility, that might have been a very distant memory of what people used to do, but it's very uncertain. It might actually have been an attempt from the author to like present something paganisque, not really pagan. So,
right, and Sakura, I think, mentions this idea that heralds of death might ride grey horses, but I can't recall whether she has any citations for that, or that's from later folklore, or is there something about the colour of horses maybe particularly evoked?
Yeah, I think grey and white horses are also used in a lot of sagas and mythologies. Yeah.
And they're kind of active participants in the funeral. I didn't mention it before, but the Oseberg tapestry with processions of horses, whether it's the cult of Frey or Freyja, or we have, you know, the idea that horses are mourners too. They actively, like Grani mourns Sigurd, and of course Sleipnir is the beast, the steed of Odin that travels between worlds. And of course we've mentioned Ibn Fadlan and the running of two horses before they're cut up, this violent demise. There were agents in the funeral is the point I'm trying to make. And we have evidence of horses killed in archaeological evidence. And to be honest, they're often assumed, and why I stop with this and I disagree is, like, I don't believe anything should be an index of any single religious thing. Same with Christianity, same with paganism. I'm not saying there's no link, but, you know, to say that, oh, killing a horse is an index of Norse, pagan, Scandinavian beliefs, well, if you look at a wider European context, that just doesn't work out, you know. And we've got, you know, it's in the Slavic areas, horse sacrifice in continental Germanic areas. So we just have to qualify that it needn't relate to a single. And I think we talked about this. The horses dedicated Freyr could only be ridden by their owner is mentioned in the Haftakal saga. So you have this idea of some kind of, maybe some kind of certain animals were, if they're not, maybe, you know, I don't know.
This
maybe
horse causes a lot of trouble in the saga, by the way. And saga horses, very questionable morality. So because the hero basically gets away with whatever he does. So.
And horse theft is definitely a bad thing. You know, people love their horses and they're valued and they're, well, you know, you can be really severely punished if you're a horse thief. I understand. So you know, surprise, surprise, in the Icelandic burial record, horse burial, from Leifson's thesis, we have, you know, lots. So on the left we have the burial grounds known to contain horse remains, the right is the total distribution. And I've looked at this a long time, and all I get out of it is that horse burials almost everywhere, although you could say well, yes, I mean, he makes some comments that there's less of it in the western fjords, but particularly in the north, the east and the south, there's plenty of horse sacrifice going on. So I mean, I think it's quite fair in this sense to think of it as an island-wide practice, although there may be, you know, more intensities in some areas. To me, my eyeballing of that says where there's burials, there's horse sacrifice, although there are less to the west, but I don't know. So I mean, Sakura estimates that 7% of Viking period graves in Norway contained horse sacrifice. And, you know, we talked about some of those. There's masculine ones. There's with stirrups and spurs. We have obviously feminine associated assemblages, and it's either the whole animal or heads only. And she's talking about Gausel here at this point before she knows that it's cattle. So she's talking about one of four with a single horse's head. Leifson reinterprets the frequency in Norway. Rather than more common in Iceland, it's as common as in Norway. So Iceland continues this practice, and we've talked about this.
Sakura's approximation was 30% in Iceland, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Sikora looks at Scotland and Ireland and makes the point there are only a few hints in Ireland. We have some in the Northern and Western Islands. It's a particular thing of Iceland. So we do have it in elsewhere in the Viking world. We have examples of horses and horse gear, but it from Leifson's evaluation, dogs and one pig bone. Right, that I mentioned that because it's important to say that non-equine, non-horse animal remains are found, and 32 dogs suggests a significant minority practice, but it's nowhere near as common as horses. There may be a slight underrepresentation of dogs, but still, I don't think we can account. So he says 148 horse graves containing 175 individual horses have been found so far, up to 2018 or 2017 when he's compiling his thesis. Found with men and women, but more common in masculine grave assemblages, pronounced as Norway in its bias, where there's 40 male and 18 female. So two horse where and we have double graves as well. And grave goods, the thing that's different about Iceland is that there's fewer grave goods overall.
Grave goods, yeah.
So it's not that horse sacrifice is more frequent, but it's more important because this society don't have the wealth of portable objects.
Horses themselves would have been very wealthy. I mean,
yes,
you cannot cross the highlands without these horses.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we find it with we have some bridle bits in Norway, but not as common. Only in 1/5 of graves compared with half in Norway, and there's a slight difference. Sikora says 113 horse graves from 316 graves. Obviously, see the sample has jumped in 18 years. So Leifson says 175 out of 355 of the total sample. So you can see the sample's gone up, and the number of horses at Leifson, because he's a zooarchaeologist, has jumped quite significantly too. Sikora says 14 of the 85 burials have more than one horse, 10 sites with 2, and 2 burials with 3, and 3 with 4. And I can't remember what Leifson's exact statistics are, but we've got also evidence of combinations, one burial with up to 8. The absence from the West has been debated as to why, but I'm not going to dwell on that because I think the main point here is horses are important in Icelandic funerary practices. Right. We don't have evidence of cremating horses from Iceland. They range in age. This is Leifson's work looking at the age range. So they're from 1.5 years old right up to 20 plus. But there's a clear trend for younger animals. So the peak years are 5 to 8 year olds and 8 to 12 year olds. So he says that means that, and I'm not an expert in horse ages, but his interpretation is that 30% of these animals are still growing. They're not fully mature. So there's not an argument to be presented here that they're just using old knackered animals that happen to be around. We should honor him, but we will do it with the oldest animal we have.
This is what happens in Volsathatter. It's one of the arguments against the story as reflecting authentic pagan practices. Yeah.
So it's quite clear that young animals could be picked. What's really interesting, they're all males. They're all stallions or gelding. I don't know whether they had, but they are male animals, right? So there's 46 out of 175 from horse graves amenable to morphological analysis, and all confirmed by Leifson to be male. Now that is, I'm not a zooarchaeology expert, but it seems really unusual that, it's very difficult to, you'd expect one ambiguous one, but that shows that's really stark. That's really clear. There's no ambiguity. So they're clearly picking animals that matter to the people, whether they're young, old, or middle-aged, and they're animals that are of the right sex. They need male animals. And this is confirmed by a recent DNA study, which looks at the ancient DNA of 22 Icelandic horse graves, 19 from graves, 3 from non-burials. Morphologically, 9 were male, 9 unsexed and 1 uncertain, but the results were 18 of the 19 horses in the graves were male versus 3 non-burial horses, and two of those were butchered human food remains from a site. So this is confirmed that it's male horses that are getting the chop at funerals.
Yeah, that's very striking.
Yeah, and you say, well, that doesn't tell us anything we didn't already know. Well, we didn't really have that stark a picture. So it fits a broader pattern in Scandinavian death ritual of bias towards males, but it's really structured sacrifice. And they seem to be bashing in the heads and cutting the throats. So this is really theatrical deaths. I mean, I don't know how you'd do otherwise, to be honest. I mean, I don't know how you would do a humane way of killing a horse, but the point is that this is part of the performance. They'd been bridled and saddled, at least in some cases, and male horses were being ridden and killed. And we talked about Dalvik in our previous discussion, where there's a single female horse in a boat grave. So there may have been exceptions, but that may be just down to the difficult interpretation. This seems to be a structured ritual, whole animals. There doesn't seem to be any of these body parts. So that's a difference. They're animals in their prime. They're harnessed and bridled, even when too young to be ridden. So like we talk about Anglo-Saxon weapon burial being not just warriors, we're not even looking at animals that you'd necessarily rely on to travel across Iceland on because they'd be too young, but you're sacrificing them for this ride into death. They're poleaxing. This is the stats from Leifson. They're stabbing, there's a range of different practices there. At Dalvik, we have horse decapitation and the head placed near the stomach. So we have some evidence they're decapitating and moving the horse, the head around. And at Brimnes, they seem to have been, the horse is beheaded in 2 burials. So we've got a consistent practice across sites. So, and we also have some really interesting double grave arrangements where in some cases they're being halved vertically, then mixed up with the hindquarters of one horse put with the front forequarters of the other. So there's some kind of interesting ritual practice here going on, and a broader sort of set of practices we're never gonna
yeah, that's what I was thinking right now,
decode.
because I don't really have any written sources that come to mind to interpret this whatsoever.
And so for me, this is really really stark, elaborate rituals. And we have one example of a rare partial interment of a shoulder blade, hindquarters, and the forequarters of a stallion near the head of a human, but the skull, ribs, and spine are absent. And that's really interesting. So what are they doing with the rest of that animal? Are they eating it? Are they depositing it elsewhere? And there's been a recent discovery of a horse skin used in lining of graves. So that makes me think, well, are there other ways in which horses are being used in the funerals that we're not aware of? Are there other strategies in which the horse is being adopted and used? And there's 9 examples of horses buried along with human graves close by, and the question is, were these horses seen as possessions or gifts or something else, or a bit of both? So here's some examples from Dalvik and I don't know how to say Sillastadir or Stillastadir, grave 4, where you've got separate two contrasts here. You got a separate pit with a human burial at Dalvik, which we talked about last time, and then here a single grave pit with both individuals together. And I love these. This is from Leyson's. I love little diagrams, but this is an example of the sort of different alternatives of what we can see. There's a standard practice of horse in the same grave as the human or separate, and then you've got these are the ones I was describing, the different combinations of placing. Now there doesn't seem to be there seems to be a lot of variety here, and it's too small a sample to see a consistency, but again, I just make the point that there's a lot of care and attention to the placing of these animals, whatever the precise choices made. They wanted them to be carefully laid out in the grave. So, and there's the point being made that this burial does mirror animals in almost like a horse fight, a horse baiting scenario. So make of that what you will. We have Merovingian examples like that too. Is this an attempt to evoke a horse fight scenario in the grave? So we've got higher frequency than Scotland and Ireland. 36% of graves, according to Leifson. Oh, that's what Sakura says. Leifson says now 34, but it's very similar. That 1/3 of graves, they're getting rid of a horse. Now, here's where the argument goes that I'm going to present and go, not so sure. is this use of horse evidence of an egalitarian society, because you're looking at sort of relatively consistency and equality? And so the argument is here, I guess, that because we know that Iceland is a less chieftain structured hierarchy, is
decentralized.
Yeah, decentralized is the best word. That's excellent. Yes. So decentralization means you're looking at a shared set of practices, and the horse is kind of a proxy for what had previously been other items in a society where it's less militarized, more rural, maybe. Horses were more available, so they become the medium of exchange. And I'm not saying I disagree with that. I just don't know about the use of the term egalitarian. I think decentralized is a much more effective term there. And Sakura says this could reflect a stable rural pagan society with little Christian influence. But Leifson makes the point that this could be, actually looking at the chronology, this may be a kind of invented tradition. That the most of these burials seem to be mid-late 10th century. So, at least, I don't know what that would be, 80 years, 70 years, and after, from the settlement period. So we may be looking at is this kind of a reconnection, a kind of, even in the Viking Age, I'm not saying this is it, I'm just saying this is the idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
We think of the saga literature as a later harking back to the Viking,
yeah.
Could this already be a kind of deliberate anachronism, an assertion of conservatism? I think a sort of a deliberate conservatism, perhaps.
Yeah, because the society was actually very mixed and very complex. If you look at the Book of Settlements, for example, it just described that, some people did return to pagan practices after colonizing Iceland, but then some other people didn't. So you have all these farmsteads basically choosing what to believe in, and I think you could imagine that they were actually also improvising their rituals, more or less.
So I think invented tradition in the Hobsbawm Ranger sense is perhaps pushing it, because I think it's about a revitalized tradition. Maybe the way I would think about it, is that when you have a distance from a homeland, you can reconfigure that. It doesn't mean you have to invent it, but you can reconfigure it in a way that has new meanings. This is from Nistelberger's DNA study. The ritual, and quoting Leifson, I think in part, the rituals are actively used in the developing society of the 10th century to affirm a Norse unchristian identity and to construct status as a materialized expression of cultural politics in a new society under formation. Well, I don't think anyone's going to consciously think that, but I like the idea of it being a sort of revitalized tradition to define a sense of Icelandicness or Icelandic identity. I don't know if that's been widely accepted, but I think it's an interesting idea to be thinking about it. And there's one final area to discuss, and that's Evans, Tang and Reuter's recent paper in 2023, which takes the approach a little bit further and says these animals are not simply about status or Icelandic identity or evidence of more decentralized society. This is a bit of what they would call para-animality. Now, Evans Tang is coming from, and Reuter are sort of collaborating on this article, coming from their different disciplinary perspectives, but they're taking a post-human perspective on Viking Age and medieval Scandinavian evidence for horse-human relationships. So they're trying to suggest we've got a bit more of a horses are not simply grave goods or proxies for grave goods. We need to understand their qualities and character in themselves. And I have a lot of sympathy with this. I'm not completely sold on the idea, but I have a lot of sympathy with this, because I think it's just saying, oh, they're killing horses because they don't have weapons, or they're killing horses because they don't have feasting gear, doesn't really explain this particular repeated frequent use of horses and its surviving remembrance. And we have horses' heads in graves they talk about from Scandinavia, and this broader, they survey the broader context we've already done of different ways in which animals were killed. And they suggest, well, is this a psychopomp, a guide to the next world, or could even the horses be active mourners? And they make the point that the horse gear is really important here because it binds people to the horses, creates an interspecies connection and bond that every time you're riding. And that's a broader point that Christina Omer has made and other writers about horse-human relationships, is that when you're riding horses, an experienced horse rider you become a hybrid.
You become a unity,
So there's but for me, I'm really sympathetic with this line of research, and it's really worth celebrating that people are thinking much more, scholars are thinking much more carefully about why horses are killed. But it doesn't then, what these studies of human animal relationships always do wrong, in my opinion, in my view, is they never then tackle the variability. Some people didn't have these horses. There's no attention to, for me, when we talked last time about the mnemonics between funerals, how mounds that were covering horses, how they were related to other graves that are added. The horses, the para-animality of the horse, the relationship of human and animal, only seems to happen in the living world. They haven't taken it fully worked out how this works in death ritual and the relationship between graves, and I don't think they fully thought through the emotional and sensorial dimensions of this sacrifice, because if these are such valued and loved beasts, that kind of violent end is kind of sits in it, it jars with that. So for me, I don't disagree with this approach, but I think there's some other lines of research that could, profitably build upon it. So going back to Scandinavia then, where we have some really striking examples of horses and dogs, such as here in the discussion of another one of these possible vulva graves from Trichrona Gridhoi. We have a broader conversation about what horses are doing in relation to people and other animals and things in these graves. And I really celebrate this attempt to think contextually about what the meanings of horses were in society, in mythology, and how horses are then disposed of in graves. But my frustration is then I don't think people have thought about the mnemonics, the sensorial aspects, and the variability of these practices. So Iceland is a case study where I'd love to see more work done and a more reflection. And I know new horse graves are being found, but I think there's more work that can be done both in Iceland and then using Iceland as a sort of a laboratory to test ideas and then taking it back and exploring the rest of the Viking world. But it's a really exciting avenue of studying the archaeology.
Yeah, definitely. To me, the most interesting aspect, because I deal mostly with the written sources, is this idea of the horse as being some sort of shaman or having the shamanistic dimension. We also have like these beautiful metaphors where the ships are described as sea Sleipnirs, so the Sleipnir of the sea. It's useful for Baldur's funeral, for example. So this idea of boundary crossing and what we've discussed about the duality is also very interesting, because I can think of other types of sources such as the Iron Age bracteates, the sea-type bracteates. If you look closely at them, you're going to see that somehow the human figures and the animal figures, they sort of like blend in or something like that. So this
so the head is like floating, isn't it?
Yeah,
almost.
Exactly.
So these are deeper time. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that it's not specific for it is specific for pre-Christian societies and much less specific for Christianity, who really tried to draw like this very clear boundary between what should be considered human and what should be considered something completely different.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Howard, thank you so much for your insights, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we would be happy if you watched our next presentations, which are definitely going to bring many more interesting aspects about death and afterlife in the Viking Age. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, everyone.